meant to be spring evening. I'm Judith Ellis, and I'm President of the Library Board. And a very special welcome to our guest tonight, Dr. Bronwyn Hughes, who's going to come up here in a minute, and whom I will introduce to you a bit later. Can I also acknowledge fellow board member Dennis? Just here, stick your hand up if you haven't met Dennis already. So our library is located on the lands of the Boer War people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and also to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here or watching us on our online facility today. Can I ask how many of you are here for the first time? Anybody? Just one person? That's nice. We've seen you, 2 people. Okay, welcome. Hope we see you again. So this library has called its home since 1854, so 171 years old this year, and we're the second oldest public library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 70,000 items in various formats, and we take great pride in being the sole library with the items for loan. So highly specialised, an extensive collection, focusing very much on local history, with a wealth of information encompassing most towns across Victoria. Just a couple of admin things before I introduce Bronwyn. Bathrooms, most of you have been here before, so you know where they are. On the other side of that wall, through this door or that door, on the other side of that wall. Emergency exits, again through that door and out that way, or that door and down. And in a very unlikely event we do have an emergency, our staff will make sure that you all exit the building safely. And we have Jade here and Ellen at the back there, who you've seen on the way in, and they're taking photos and a video for today's event. We use that for promotional purposes and for the presentation to appear on our YouTube channel, if you want to revisit any of it again. If you don't want to be included, because sometimes we pan the camera or photo or video, but if you prefer not to be included, just let us know and we can accommodate that. So, introducing Dr. Bronwyn Hughes OAM. Tonight's presentation is acknowledging Remembrance Day, of course, which it is today. So, Bronwyn is an art historian, a writer and a lecturer with specific interest in stained glass of the 19th and 20th centuries. To my mind, you can't have enough glass. I've got so many bowls and vases. My dear friend here knows and keeps fueling me with it. But we're going to hear something a whole lot more interesting in my collection at home. So prior to Bronwyn's retirement, she taught glass studies at Monash University, at the Holmesglen Institute and the University of Melbourne. 10 years ago, Bronwyn and her colleague Donna Kennedy started the highly successful not-for-profit Glass Inc., an organisation called Glass, GLAAS, which you can, Glass, Light, Art, Architecture, Synergy. That's what it stands for, so we can hear more about that later. And this enterprise is to promote the conservation of Australia's historic stained glass and also contemporary glass in architecture. And we're going to hear a bit more about that tonight. So we've got a movie and we'll hear from Bronwyn as well. And I must say, do pop into Glass. It's just round the corner. So at the bottom of our street here, St Edmunds Road, just round the corner, 140 High Street, Paran. It's open 3 days a week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And I had a look on the website, there's some gorgeous things in there. The organisation does all sorts of stuff, workshops, things with students, displays. You can tell us more about it if you choose. A bit of a plug. It just looked beautiful from what I can see, and I can see a good reason to pop in. So please welcome Bronwyn.
Thank you, Judy. Now I don't have to do all that stuff about glass. That's fantastic. Could I too start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today here or online. It's a great pleasure to be with you at the PMI Library, and Jade and I were just saying, we started this discussion 18 months ago, I think, and it was a bit late then for Remembrance Day last year. So Jade said, "Oh, why not next year?" And here we are already. Where did this year go? Who knows? Anyway. So you mentioned glass ink. I think our finest contribution in the last 10 years has been the establishment of accredited TAFE courses on the campus of Melbourne Polytechnic here. And I have to thank Melbourne Polytechnic for being quite keen to drop themselves on the end of the limb by taking on something which was a little niche. It's not glazing or glass and glazing, it is decorative glazing for building and for conservation. So all power to them for taking us on and supporting us ever since. And it's because of Melbourne Poly that we do have that lovely space at 140 High Street, which of course is the old Brand Mechanics Institute. And we love the building. Sure, there's a bit of rising damp and other problems, but it's such a beautiful building and it's perfect spot for us to be able to show glass in all its glory. So in this talk, I'm going to make the talk fairly brief. I hope if I go on too long, give me the word. And then follow that with the film that we made a couple of years ago. And I thought rather than have you watch the film cold, I would give you a bit of background on how we came to make the film. It's not intended to be more than an introduction though, and I'm very happy to answer questions afterwards. And by all means, have a look at the book and say, well, you didn't talk about that one. Well, that's not surprising because there are so many in the book. Anyway, I started this, I suppose, when I was a kid, sitting in church, bored to sobs with the sermon and looking up at the windows in my local Anglican church, which was in Elstonwick. And I thought these windows are so old. They were 4 years old. But I found that out years later. But they were using 19th century design still in the 20th century because everyone wanted to stick with the traditions of the past. Well, I'm here to say that's gone. We have this sort of thing, which is 1960s. But yes, that's probably where it started. But although I had been researching stained glass for many years, it was probably this man here, if I can remember how to work this man here, William Montgomery, who focused my sights particularly on commemorative stained glass windows. After the First World War, or during actually the First World War and after, he made more than 80 windows for churches mostly, civic buildings occasionally, schools and university chapels, mainly in Victoria, but even some further afield. Now, the window pictured at either side of Mr. Montgomery is of a window in Christchurch, South Yarra. It's not a war memorial, but I put it in just to explain what was happening before the First World War. The young man who died was a lieutenant in the Australian Field Artillery, but he died, as people did so often in those days, of diphtheria, which had developed after a bout of smallpox while he'd been in India, and he was 27. The interesting thing for me is how the window changes from the little sketch that you see there in black and white to the finished window. And they've actually dropped in, William Montgomery has dropped in a portrait of the young man. So it's quite a different face, you'll see even from that distance. The generic face in the photo and in the window itself, it's the young man. And so often, in this case, it wouldn't have been the case, I don't think, because they would have seen him. He died in Melbourne, near his family home. But so often for war, there was no body. The body was left on the battlefield, and no Australians came back except for General Bridges, who's buried up in Canberra. So this is quite a way of keeping your son, your brother, your father alive in your own mind, I guess. There wasn't even a headstone that they could go and visit the grave on a Sunday. So the warrior Saint Michael is the featured subject, and even before this, during the Boer War, St Michael was already the subject of windows of men who died and would endure through all wars to come. And the first slide, you mightn't have noticed it, but you'll see it again. St Michael was up the top of that 1966 window too. So a very enduring figure, a warrior saint, and perfect for many people. Now, about Montgomery, he arrived in marvellous Melbourne, the height of the boom period, in late 1886, and by February 1887, he was commissioned for windows in Wagga, I better say the whole name, Wagga, and in Yass. That was thanks to his wife. He married an American Catholic, he was Anglican English, and she came with some wonderful letters of introduction, which was how you got your jobs in those days. And one was to the recently elevated Cardinal Moran of Sydney, who happened to be a friend of her local bishop in America. So I think that was how he got his start, but he very soon had a reputation for his work. He also worked at the same time at the Anglican Church in Melbourne. St Stephen's Richmond has one of his very early windows, and St Paul's in Sale. But he became Melbourne's leading stained glass artist and remained so for the next 40 years. He died in 1927 while he was still working on designs for a new Warriors Chapel, First World War Memorial, Warriors Chapel at Bathurst Cathedral. So I'm not going to show you many examples, but one or two that give the sense of the glass designer and glass painter's skill. And you all may know the places, but it's less likely that you're aware of the windows. Therefore, the title of this talk, Hidden in Plain Sight. Firstly, Geelong Grammar School's Chapel of All Saints. And Montgomery designed and made 7 two-light windows over several years as donors came forward. Geelong's headmaster, Dr. Francis Brown, was determined that the chapel's windows would all be British saints, thank you very much, suitable exemplars for the boys. Although later he did allow Sir Galahad and St Nicholas, but only in the vestries. Each window is a tragedy, a loss for families, friends and fellow soldiers. Geelong Grammar lost a higher percentage of old boys, and I should have got the figure, but it's quite horrifying, than any other church school in Australia. More than 400 of their old boys joined up, but the percentage was still quite a deal higher than other schools. And I think that was because so many of them became second lieutenants immediately. They would all been in the cadets, so they all had these lower officer status, so they were the first over the top. It's sadly and inevitably what happens. Second example of Montgomery's work shows St Michael. Again, but this time at the Carnham Presbyterian Church, Snake Valley, west of Ballarat. St Michael here is a resplendent figure, complete with pennant, shield, and 2 angels hovering above with the crown of life, a recurring theme, particularly in Presbyterian churches. But Montgomery's saints are rarely triumphant. His eyes in this case too, hold a sadness for earthly loss, even if the message is one of triumph over death. In 2008, I curated an exhibition of Montgomery's commemorative windows at the Shrine of Remembrance. It went further and detailed his support for the war effort as president of the Victorian Artists Society during the early years of the war, for which he was honoured with the Order of the British Empire in 1921. But it was the quality and range of the commemorative window that set me thinking about just how many other windows had been designed and made by artists and firms across the country in the aftermath of this war and the wars that followed, right up to Vietnam. With no inventory of Australian glass anywhere and very little published scholarship, I set about a systematic survey of Victorian churches, hospitals, civic buildings, schools, and any other likely hiding place to build a database of raw information for the first time. Although it contained more than 500 sites by the time I'd finished, collected over several years, I was not convinced by any stretch of the imagination that I'd found them all and I've been proved right. But at least it was a starting point for more in-depth research. Now, by the time we get to the 1920s, there was a distinct change in iconography with the acceptance of the human figure, the Australian digger. First of all, by non-religious organisations such as the Melbourne Teachers College, but that was quickly followed by church, clergy and congregations just taking him on board. The digger in his khaki uniform and rifle was as acceptable as the armour-clad St Michael or St George with their swords and shields. I always get that tongue tied. All three continued to represent the courage and service and sacrifice of the soldier. St Michael was adopted by many faiths, including the Jewish faith, and gained popularity after the Second World War, where he often represented airmen. And I find that really interesting that St Michael would be a flying angel was accepted. St George was definitely anchored to the ground, but not St Michael. Also, the portrait makes an appearance with airmen too, and I think that was, again, because often they didn't even know where planes went down, and so having the portrait in the window made a big difference. Montgomery too produced several examples of the digger in stained glass, this one for St George's Presbyterian, Geelong. Unlike the windows at Geelong Grammar, which are all memorials to individual young men, this window commemorates all 21 young men from the congregation who served and died for King and country and God. In the 1930s, another prominent Melbourne school, Scotch College, selected both saints and legendary figures for its memorial hall, which had been opened the year before by their most famous war hero, Sir John Monash. King Arthur and Sir Galahad rubbed shoulders with Saints Andrew, Martin, Michael and George, with the Scotch College crest and motto alternating with the crests of England, Australia and Scotland in the bases, and those of the Australian states above the heads of the figures. It's quite a complex symbolic window. Just in case, though, that you're thinking all glass memorials were large, painted figure windows, I've included a very modest example from a Western Victoria rural community. And sometimes the stories behind finding these sorts of windows are quite funny, but I haven't got time for that now. This small window was installed high on the gable end, just above the porch, you can see. It uses symbols, again, to represent sacrifice. The crossed flags of Britain and Australia, the laurel wreath and palm leaves symbolising victory and peace, and a central honour board, quite small, naming the 5 young men from the district who died at war. In communities such as Broughton, this must have been devastating. Now, my Victorian survey was published in 2016 by the Department of Premier and Cabinet on their Victorian War Heritage Inventory website, and it's still online. It's a little bit out of date, I have to say, but it's a bit hard to fix. Anyway, after further research interstate and overseas, I finally produced the book, Lights Everlasting, Commemorative Stained Glass from the Boer War to Vietnam, which I think you have a copy out there, and I have a couple of copies here too. It was quite amazing that finally it got published. As you can see from what I've presented already, one thing leads to another, and an idea for a film began to emerge. I'd felt for some time that images of stained glass showed a greater advantage when closer to their actual size, as you can get on a screen, and they capture more light somehow. So much better than paper in many ways. The idea continued to evolve over time, and the results we will see tonight in the documentary. The disadvantage is that we had to restrict ourselves to show very few examples. While the book has about 170, but I hope we've teased out the stories around each window so that they represent a bigger picture of what's behind the windows and right across the country. I hope too that we tell the story of the buildings, the donors, the artists and firms involved, and importantly, the men and women who were commemorated within the glass. And that we have captured too the changing of Australian society as we move through the decades of the 20th century, the communities that brought each window into being and how they're seen in the 21st century. Now maybe we can look at the documentary, and I'll add to the story afterwards if we have it in time for questions when I finish that.
2 seconds. Right. There's just going to be a short, loud noise while I plug the AUX cable in, so just free answer warning.
Thank you.
We've all seen stained glass windows in churches and halls around Australia, but have you ever thought what they're for and who they're for? This is a film about stained glass and how it has been used to commemorate those who served in 5 separate wars in 3 separate centuries. In Australia, one of the most recent is the Mother's Window at St Augustine's Anglican Church in Hamilton, Queensland. It commemorates the awarding of a posthumous Victoria Cross to Corporal Cameron Baird, 2nd Commando Regiment. Kay and Doug Baird are determined to keep their son's name and his sacrifice alive.
We acknowledge what Cameron did. He gave his life for his country, for his unit, for his fellow soldier. And I think that's why that he was loved and respected so much, not only by his team, but the general public.
Architectural glass artist Christopher John was chosen to develop a stained glass window as a memorial to Cameron Baird's war service. The design of the window was constrained by the historical and architectural context within the church.
But I guess the most important thing is the context of these windows. In 1919, when the church was built, directly after the First World War, it was dedicated as a war memorial church. So now, almost 100 years later, there's 100 stained glass windows in that church, all dedicated to different aspects of the war and, the armed services. What was said was that any architectural ornamentation, this base and the canopy, sometimes called tabernacling, that had to be the same, so it fitted in the adjacent window. The colour scheme had to be similar, and the sizing of the figures had to be similar. So what I've done is I've used this very Victorian way of treating landscape and plants. But looking at photos I'd seen from the First World War, that there was a lot of ladders, you know, climbing in and out of trenches. They used ladders, and there were the duck walks across the muddy terrain. So I've got this very angular and sort of aggressive backdrop, but then I've used a very sort of soft and gentle lyrical posing of the figures after having to kind of follow suit with the other windows. The base of the window was left, so I used a military shield, and this was where the committee really kind of rose to the occasion. They were terrific because I had many different solutions for this, but someone had said, why, I've got a newspaper clipping. Quentin Bryce, the Governor-General, she has just awarded the 100th Victoria Cross to the mother of a fallen soldier. So the image from the front of the newspaper was a female hand reaching out and placing a Victoria Cross into another female hand.
In 2015, the Mother's Window was unveiled at St Augustine's Anglican Church, Hamilton, Queensland. 2 hands, one handing the VC to another. Former Australian Governor-General Dame Quentin Bryce has come to meet Kay and Doug at the church.
Dame Quentin, when she handed over the Victoria Cross to us, that was a real special moment, and that was her hand on top of my hand, explaining just what it all meant. And it was like from one mother to another mother.
There's so much touches my heart about them. I think the hands particularly are symbolic of the bonds that women share. I think to have this beautiful art here, really, I mean, it's art and beauty and a very powerful symbolism that we see. It will provoke storytelling that will inspire generations, will be told again and again and again, and it will always be there, I'm sure.
Bronwyn Hughes is an art historian and an expert on commemorative stained glass in Australia.
We all associate stained glass with scenes from the Bible and images of saints. But in fact, stained glass has been used to memorialise wars in Europe and Britain from the Middle Ages, often depicting people who were defenders of the faith. It was not until the 19th century that ordinary, everyday people were named on windows. This was a tradition that was brought by the colonisers when they came to Australia. The first commemorations in stained glass in Australia were during the Boer War. Before that, we were not involved in international conflicts to a great enough extent to be able to commemorate men who died. In fact, very few did. Images that were used for the Boer War were similar to this one behind me here, Charlton window, but sometimes they also depicted the saints. So we have windows to St Michael and St George, particularly the two saints most associated with war, warriors themselves, and therefore could be commandeered for the cause of stained glass and still be acceptable into the church. Windows of the Boer War was the first time that we saw portraits in stained glass. The young men who'd gone away to war not to return, and therefore their families had this opportunity to put their memory of their son or their father or their brother into an image that they could use as a form of headstone in the absence of a grave.
The Charlton window, which Bronwyn Hughes just mentioned, was originally installed in Euroa, central Victoria, in 1903. This photo is from when it was installed. It commemorates the service and sacrifice of Private John Charlton in the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902. The window features a helmet of salvation superimposed over a sword of sacrifice and a shield. These emblems and the inscription below convey community beliefs in service to God and in a just cause, a cause that led Australians to fight during the Second Boer War and later the First World War. There's also a story behind this window. It was installed in 1903, but then it was dismantled and stored and completely forgotten until the 1980s. It's been painstakingly restored by Bruce Hutton and Phil Davis of Arm & Glassworks. In November 2016, it was donated to the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. After installation in the lower level, the window was officially launched by the Governor of Victoria, Linda Dessau, on the 8th of June 2017.
It's an honour for me to be able to officially acknowledge the exhibiting of the John Charlton Memorial window, and I look forward to viewing its rich but not gaudy beauty in a few moments' time. Thank you.
This window has become much more than a memorial to one man. It isn't even a memorial to all those in central Victoria who died during the conflict of the Boer War, but has come to represent all Victorians who died in South Africa.
Back at Christopher John's studio, he's showing photos of the live models he used for the Hamilton windows. He also uses photographs, and they've been used from the beginning in Australia, especially portraits of the dead. Here's Nathaniel Horsfall as St Nathaniel in the Anglican Church of the Good Shepherd, Bowden, Adelaide. Keith Kinnaird, McKellar and St James's Anglican Church, Sydney, has become St George. Bart Zeno is a historian who's made a study of the emotional impact of war and how war has been commemorated.
Well, the First World War was an industrialised war on a scale that was unprecedented, and in comparison to something like the Boer War, the death rate was something like 100 times what Australians had experienced. So we've had 600 deaths in the Boer War. In the First World War, we're looking at 60,000 deaths and 150,000 people wounded. The scale of loss in the First World War left an enormous hole in the Australian community, and it required explaining, and the way Australians explained it to themselves was through the creation of memorials. Memorials spoke to what they thought they had fought for and what the sacrifice of their people had meant.
Dear Harold, I have just had a feast of roast pork, during which I thought of those we've had in Melbourne. I'm just about to return to France after 12 days' leave in England. It is a rotten idea going back to the mud and cold in France. You couldn't have the least idea of what the mud is. I hope I may be able to tell you someday. For the prayer from your brotherly Ray. Corporal Raymond Tenby, Australian Imperial Force, December 15th, 1916.
There are an extraordinary array of memorial types in Australia that are created after the First World War. There are obelisks and soldier statues that stand in public spaces, in town squares and so forth. There are honour boards tucked away in all sorts of buildings. And of course, there are stained glass windows in buildings all around the country.
This is Raucon, a small Aboriginal community on the shores of Lake Alexandrina in South Australia. It was the home of Indigenous inventor David Yanarpon, but the community was significant in other respects. The church here may be small, but its appearance on the $50 note is significant, as it contains the only stained glass window commissioned by Indigenous Australians to commemorate their soldiers in World War I.
Rauken means traditional meeting place, or ancient meeting place. And it was a place where if you were part of the Ngarrindjeri nation, whether you were a Ramangiri person from over on the Fleurieu and the other side of the country, or whether you were a Tangani person from the Coorong, or a Yarrabee person going up the mighty Murray River, you'd all come by water and meet right here. It was really central. And it was for the meeting of the nation of Ngarrindjeri people. And Ngarrindjeri just means people belong to people. So they had a system of how they cared for each other, looked after each other, but where they were interdependent as well.
The window was put in after the First World War in order to honour the men from all the district, but particularly from Rauken. The 4 in the window are from Rauken, and they died in the service of their country. It took a long time to raise the money for this little enterprise. Presumably, the community just raised it as they could, and so in 1925 the first window went in place here. Now this is a replacement because the place went to rack and ruin in the 1970s, and so it wasn't until the 1980s that we get the replacement window go in along the same lines as the first one, with the same intention to honour the men who fought and died in the First World War. It just makes this unique and so worthy of preservation and so marvellous that it was thought to be by the community so important that it was rebuilt.
Well, Rufus and Cyril are my grandmother's brothers, so they're my great uncles, or we'd say Orpa, in our language. But yeah, Uncle Rufus and Uncle Cyril, young men. Uncle Rufus only really 17 when he went. Got a little bit of a fib. Look, sometimes you think, what could have been, but all of these men, all of the men that we look at on that park over there, they all served overseas, and then you had the rest of the men serving domestically. So it was a whole community effort, but I don't think many people would understand that communities of people who did this all around this country.
The symbolism within the window is pretty clear. We have the British flag on one side and the Australian flag on the other side. And the two of them are united by these ribbons right through. And then in the centre, we have honour the dead, faithful unto death. The Australian Rising Sun badge became popular. Then the laurel wreath around each of those texts signified heroic action. And for all those men who died, it was a huge heroic sacrifice. I just love the window. It's so beautifully elegant and eloquent in the way that it tells the story.
Indigenous Australians were formerly restricted from enlistment in the First World War. The rule was that you had to be substantially of European origin. This didn't prevent Indigenous people from enlisting. In fact, the current estimate is that something over 1,000 Aboriginal Australians enlisted for service in the First World War. They served very bravely and some with great distinction.
World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but 20 years later, the world was at war again, and Australia was sending men and women to Europe, the Middle East and Asia. The stained glass windows at St Bridget's Church, Mordialloc in Victoria commemorate action nearer to home in New Guinea, and also show that modernism was influencing new styles in stained glass.
This window marks an important change in stained glass after the Second World War. It's particularly windows that uses modernism, as its basis, obviously to fit with the interior of the church, and the architect was quite deliberate in choosing Alan Sumner as his artist to do this work, and it was so important from the point of view of commemoration. Alan had already worked out when he did a window at Frankston that he could come in with a reasonable budget by using really good quality glass for the main areas of the window, the ones he wanted to accentuate, but then around the edges he could use commercial glass. He could give the parish, and particularly Father English, who was so crucial to this window, and to the Battalion Association, exactly what he felt it needed to tell the story. Father English was one of several padres that served with the 58th, 59th. He was by far the most loved and flamboyant, in a wonderful way, of the men that served as chaplains to that group. Father English would often be found travelling by himself in areas where the Japanese were running patrols. It'd be quicker for him to do that than to take the 3.5-hour journey to go and see some company that he maybe hadn't seen for nearly a week, and he didn't like that. He liked to go and see his men whenever he possibly could, and to do that he took the shortest path. Hallmarks of modernism in stained glass refer very much to getting rid of that 19th century tabernacling, the architectural work that used to cover around the windows. Here we have none of that. It's very pared back. There's a fair bit of realism here. There was often abstraction, and there is some abstraction as well, but it was at a time when people could accept the abstraction for what it was and see the figures that they would recognise very much as those Second World War figures. Older windows that used the digger were much more like saints standing up within their frame. But by the time the 1950s comes along and this window is commissioned for this church, we've accepted the digger in his jungle greens. We've accepted that you can put guns in the shot. Here, they're great big 25-pounders probably, that were hauled over these mountains in New Guinea by these men, in bits admittedly, but to be able to react to the Japanese invasion was a very different way of looking at stained glass, telling the narrative much more than just the symbolism of one figure or one saint. The role of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, as they were called, was crucial for both supply of food and equipment and getting the stretchered wounded out, and also the supplies back in to those that were left to carry on. Alan Sumner has used those realistic elements of the supplies coming in by parachute, the men being stretchered out by the native bearers, the men climbing those mountains, particularly Double Mountain, which was one of the ones that really stood out for the men as their baptism of fire.
The response to war in 1939 from Australians was much more sombre than it had been in the previous war. They knew what to expect and they knew what the costs might be. They were committed to this war. They believed fighting the Nazis and defending the British Empire were good aims. The war changed radically with the advent of war against Japan, and this caused Australians to be of their lives. And this kind of war demanded new expectations from people for a better society afterwards, and that involved things like government being involved in the provision of welfare, housing security, employment and unemployment benefits, and healthcare into the future. And this is really the reward that people expect for their participation in this kind of war. Australia's a changing place after World War II. One of the key catalysts for that change is the mass immigration program, which brings people from all parts of Europe to Australia. They bring new culture, new ideas, and we also have the baby boom that is producing a younger population in Australia. Australians find themselves involved still in a rolling set of conflicts in the region, whether that's in Korea, in Malaya, or in Vietnam.
The war caused deep divisions in society, and many returning servicemen were shunned. It made commemorating the war and those who served a very difficult task.
By the time we're commemorating the Vietnam War, stained glass is totally out of fashion. But the development of new technologies and techniques in glass makes it more adaptable to different environments, including outdoor ones.
It's August the 18th, 2023, and Vietnam veterans have gathered in Seymour, Central Victoria, to mark the 50th anniversary of the end of Australia's involvement in the war. This is also the site of the Vietnam Commemorative Walk. In 106 glass panels, it commemorates the more than 60,000 Australian men and women who valiantly served in the Vietnam War. The service was attended by Army personnel and Vietnam veterans. And most importantly, representatives from 3 local schools: Seymour College, St Mary's College and Puckapunyal Primary School.
Good morning, locals, schools and others who are gathered here today. Thank you to the brave men and women, living and deceased, who served our country during the difficult days of the Vietnam War.
Following the official ceremony, the students walked with the veterans and with serving soldiers to place poppies and wreaths beneath the glass panels of the memorial wall.
Jan McCarthy on behalf of the nurses.
That's Jan McCarthy, one of the nurses who gave dedicated service in the operating theatres of Vietnam and who has campaigned for the role of nurses to be recognised in memorials such as this one. In the light of the massive social changes since World War II, traditional forms of commemorating the war dead have seen a major rethink. Far fewer people attend church services, and for many, they are no longer the centre of the community. But people need to remember and to honour those who served. Finn Murphy was part of the team who designed the Vietnam Commemorative Walk.
When the project was announced by the Mitchell Shire, it was for a black granite wall with 60,000 engraved names in it. I've got 2 young daughters, and I said, you know, if you want me to be a person that brings up my family, to be shared the story that you want to tell, we're going to have to do something, firstly, a lot better than a black granite wall with lists of names, because that, you know, we won't come, my children won't be engaged. At the time, we'd been working in glass and particularly looking at artwork in glass and narratives, using glass as a medium for sharing those stories. There's no limit in terms of the visual content we can include in a glass panel. You know, the limitation is our imagination. The vets group had been collecting about, I think it was about 4,500 photographs from men on tour from both Australia and New Zealand, and they had this huge visual resource. And then when we suggested we could use this imagery to tell a story, it just opened the world up to what this war could be. And I think that challenged the committee in a lot of ways, because, you know, how do you tell the story? It is a contentious part of our history. How do you tell the right story? And how do you bring everyone along the journey and not be biased in one particular position. In the 6 panels, and then there's 2 end panels, so that's 108. Then there's a commemorative panel for those who died, the Killed in Action panel. And then on the western side of the wall, we have another 4 for the VC recipients, Victoria Cross Awards. What we see today and the story that's told in the glass panels is really a tribute to the involvement of the Vietnam vets through the committee that was put together to work on the project.
The Vietnam War, the most divisive in Australia's history, continues to hold a fascination for generations that were not born when it happened. At St Patrick's Primary School, Kilmore, teacher Shelley McCalkey started a project in 2021 to explore the war with her students.
Meeting the people involved in the Vietnam War, it was very interesting. Just hearing their stories from their years of service changed my perspective that I had on war, and that it had a very much a profound impact on lives, because it's not so much during the war, it's also after the war. It's sometimes very sad, other times it's very rewarding that people do find happiness after Vietnam, and that they have.
They learned how to edit the interviews and were also taught by professional stills photographers how to take high-quality photographs of the veterans. Their work is showcased in this corridor of the school. Their recorded interviews can be accessed using a phone app triggered by a QR code on the plaque. Vietnam veteran Dennis Craig came to the school so Oscar could show him the recording of his interview using Dennis's phone.
Oscar, I'd like you to meet Dennis.
Hi, good to meet you, Dennis.
It might be very different from the stained glass of Victorian windows, but when Dennis sees his story glowing from a glass screen on his mobile phone, it's another form of illumination and commemoration that keeps the bravery of those that served and the sacrifice of those that never returned alive. The fact that so many young people are interested in Australia's wartime history, and especially in those who served, is deeply meaningful to Dennis Craig and other veterans. In the 125 years since the Second Boer War began, the techniques and designs of glass monuments has changed in so many ways. But one thing that remains a constant is the importance of glass, which, through its transparency and inherent beauty, lets the light shine forever.
So we've got time for a few questions. We started 5 minutes later than planned. Dennis.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn, for that. I've got 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first one is that just a casual observation of a person who wanders around churches. Very hard to find out who made the window.
Oh, yes.
I'll just tell you the second one too. Is what is your photographic technique for getting photographs of stained glass windows?
Oh dear. I tend to not take them anymore, except a happy snap on my phone, like everybody else these days, because the old way I used to do it was slide film, and I have 3 filing cabinets full of slides, and I would bracket them so that I would, overexpose, underexpose, and get what I thought was right. Don't turn the lights on in the church. Make sure they don't want to, make it easy for her to walk around. You want to be able to have the light coming through the window, not onto the window. That's probably the main thing, and to expose rather than overexpose. David Smith was the producer of the film and the cinematographer. He is now, he would like to go back to Mordialloc and film the whole thing again. So would I, actually. I had COVID, or I was just getting over COVID. I tested negative and I was okay, but I felt absolutely shocking and it shows. He would like to do it with his new camera. So even he was unhappy with the result, really. Never mind, it is what it is, and we get the message, I hope, across. As for how you find out about what's in churches and wandering around and not being able to find information, I have to say it's so much better than it used to be. When I was a student in the 70s starting this, I would go into a church and there'd be nothing. There'd be no information on anything. At least churches now kind of recognise the need. And somebody said there was a book down there. Oh, look, Louise, you said there was a book on the East Ivanhoe Church. And the windows in that, which were also by Alan Sumner, who did the Mordialloc window. So there is some greater interest in doing that, but yes, it's still very hit and miss. Stained glass people tend still not to sign their windows. William Montgomery always did. He was brought up that way in England. His particular firm, his master, signed the windows, so he continued to do it. Alan Sumner did too, but he was a modernist. Stained glass grew out of a medieval guild, and nobody took the artist as anyone more important than anyone else. Everyone was involved in the craft guild, and so nobody signed work. It's a very Renaissance idea to sign your work. So it makes it very hard for art historian or visitor, let me tell you.
Thank you.
Oh, lead light and stained glass, are they two different words meaning the same thing?
These days they're often interchanged, but really lead light is the putting together of glass and lead, the crafting, if you like, which is very important so that windows don't leak. The art is more in the glass painter and the original design ideas. So we call Christopher John there a glass artist, but he's also a lead lighter because he puts the whole thing together at the end as well. The old firm way of doing it, the 19th century trade way of doing it, was to have somebody do the design on a thumbnail, and I brought some thumbnails in just so that you get an idea, just the drawing called a thumbnail. And they would then be sent to the draftsman who would draft it up into a full-scale drawing of the window with every detail on it that they needed to know, what colour glass, a number put on it. Then it would go to the cutting room where they cut all the different glasses into shape. Then it would go to the paint room where they put it up on an easel so there was light coming through it, and they paint every part of the window that needed painting, go and be fired, come back, paint it again. Maybe that happened 3 times. When they were happy with the tonal values across the window, it would go to the lead light room where the foreman would get different parts of it, because they're all made in pieces about this big, be made up. Then it goes to the cement room where they put putty in it to stop it rattling and make it weatherproof. And then some poor installer has to get up a ladder or a scaffold and put it in a window opening. I remember interviewing somebody from Brooks Robinson in Melbourne, many of you will know that firm, who had moved to Perth. And I went and interviewed him and said, can you tell me where any of your windows were? Because he was a painter. And Jim turned to me and he said, "Oh, I never knew where they were. I'd just get St George and I'd do St George and pass him on." And of course, Brooks Robinson's records mostly went to the tip.
Oh.
Yes.
First up, thank you very much for that. Secondly, a few years ago, I was quite interested in war memorials generally in New South Wales. I hadn't seen the light in those days. And what I noticed was that trying to get into churches, Catholic churches were nearly always open, whereas Protestant churches were very hard to get into, except on Sunday when you could dodge in the start or conclusion of a service. Have you found the same, and if so, why?
Yes. When I first started this in the 70s, it wasn't so difficult. You could rock up to a church and probably be open. But over time, it's become less and less available. As you say, Catholic churches are usually open. It mightn't be the main door, but you can usually get in a side door. And now it's a matter of organising with the parish office to have a time that you can actually get in. I think there was a period where there were a lot of thefts and that people did not respect the environment in which they were. And there aren't the numbers of people going to church now to actually be there to look after it and keep the doors open. One of the real problems is that closure of churches, and it was one of the motivating factors for me in doing that initial survey to try to get some of them before they were no longer available whatsoever. And they might turn into Heavenly Pancakes or Angel's Cafe or whatever they thought up for their names. And you could see them, but too often they were being turned into private houses or even demolished altogether. Recently in Tasmania, the Anglican bishop there decided to put 120 properties, I think, up for sale. Now, some of the bigger churches were able to band together or raise money and actually buy back what they had built, which is fairly sort of incongruous. But yes, supposedly for the Anglican redress scheme. So that caused a real flurry, but when you looked at it, some of those congregations were down to 6. And the upkeep of buildings, as we all know, is bad enough, but an old... So I can see why he wanted to offload this absolute weight, but it's difficult. It's a vexed question, especially when some of them are just beautiful. In fact, I could have bought the Fingal Anglican Church and 2-storey vicarage for something like $350,000. Seems a crime to me.
Bronwyn, there's a church in Cairns, it's probably 17 years since I last saw it, with the most fantastic glass window. Not honouring from memory heroes or saints, and they're more that sort of shape, this big rectangular shape, and they're, from memory, very big imagery and a lot of nature, and there's been quite an Indigenous input into that. I can't remember all the details, but they're fabulous and very bright, very colourful. Don't know if you're aware of it.
If I said St Monica's Cathedral, Cairns, would that mean anything to you?
I'm not sure. I just
looks
know,
like the proportions of a shoebox.
But inside huge windows, could well be.
Just a square rectangular box, rather.
Yeah.
Size of a shoebox, I always thought. 11 windows down one side. window above the west door and down the other side?
I don't remember that much detail. I just remember there being, it was a small church.
Oh, it's a
I just
small
knew it
church.
as Keggs Cathedral. I don't think it would have been 11, but there were certainly quite a few, and they were huge, and all that sort of shape rather than.
Right, okay. No,
very different.
I thought it might have been Cairns Cathedral, which is the story of the creation. And there was a very interesting priest who, Bishop James Foley, who said to the artists who were Jerry Cummins and Jill Sten from Umundi, formerly of Melbourne, so they're all right. They said, he said to them, right, I want to tell the story of the creation. I don't want any saints in the windows. I want it scientifically correct, and I want it to reflect far north Queensland. Go away and do something. So he started with a window that was before the Big Bang. So it's almost black. If you look at this window, it's worth going to the cathedral in Cairns just to see it. It's almost black, but if you sit there long enough, you realise there are differences in the glass that allow you to sort of have a little bit of an inkling. And then in the next one, you get the singular, I can never say the word, that crystal company, crystal in the middle of it. Say it all again. Sure, yeah, that's the one. And that is the Big Bang about to happen. You go right round, and the rear window above the west doors, huge west doors, is the 50th anniversary of the Coral Sea. It's in the book. I think some of it's in the book, just details, because it's a very hard window to photograph. And he's got above the sea and under the sea, so that all these windows gradually part from the Big Bang into earth, sky, and all the rest of it. You don't get any humans until window 16. And then putting us in our place are these little tiny figures under these huge far north Queensland trees. And they're all local trees. You know, I don't know which they are, but every one is sort of slightly different. So, and people come in to say, oh, why is that Angophora there? That's fantastic. And it really speaks to the local people in that way. And then the little figures are all black. And of course, for some people, that's a problem. And I was there the day after I spoke at the unveiling. And this lady said, I asked her what she thought of it. I didn't say who I was. I was just there watching people's reactions. And I said, what do you think of it? She said, I really like these windows. She said, Adam and Eve weren't black. And I thought, what on earth do I say to that? We don't know, but, you know, it was just a lovely comment from her and just left me really a bit nonplussed. I didn't know what to say. But it ends up with not the end of the world, but a rainbow and a new bang, really. It's and priest was very happy. Bishop Foley thought it was terrific.
Bronwyn, thank you so much for this talk. It was really fascinating. Can I just take you back to the very beginning where you spoke about the warrior St. Michael? And I'll only ask because my name is Michaela, and like the feminine Michael. I always thought Michael was the archangel, and so I think that's right. So is that perhaps why there's this kind of connection with the RAF and the flying?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. He's definitely an archangel, but he's also seen as a warrior saint along with St. George as well, which also puts him right nicely with the soldiers as well. And of course, he's the judger of souls, so he goes from being lots of things. Yeah, he's the one who weighs your soul when you get to heaven. And are you worthy? So watch him.
In the interest of time, we might just wind up here, but there's plenty to have a look.
Oh, and please take a bookmark. And if you're interested in the film, there's a little brochure there. Take one of those as well. Sorry, I can't give the books away, but you can certainly have those. Very happy.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. That's very entertaining, engaging, and certainly very interesting stuff I've never heard of at all. So absolutely wonderful. We love your work. I'm sure we'll see some more. If you like what you've heard tonight, do join us for other evening and daytime events. We've got a book sale coming up on Saturday from 10 till 4 or 3. 10 till 3. So come along for the book sale, and you can pop just around the corner and go to Glass. It's open on Saturdays. Yes. Thank you very much. We have a small gift just as a token of our appreciation. Please thank Bronwyn very much. There's more tea, coffee and biscuits if you want something.